I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty, and at the heavens, and their light was gone, before the Lord, before his fierce anger. These are the words written by Jeremiah, who prophesied the impending judgment and destruction that would fall upon his homeland, the kingdom of Judah, and its royal city, Jerusalem. And in 587 BC, Jerusalem fell to the besieging armies of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which then proceeded to raze the city to the ground. What should catch our attention, though, is that this prophecy is a clear reference to the opening of the Genesis creation account. The world is formless and empty, and God is yet to speak forth the light. But Jeremiah's vision is the reversal of Genesis. God has turned the world back into the formless, empty, fathomless depth of water and darkness at the beginning. Of course, the vision did not imply that God will actually unmake all that ever exists. Only the city of Jerusalem will be destroyed. But for Jeremiah and the ancient Hebrews, this unmaking was God's judgment on Jerusalem. The idea is, when a society or people become irreversibly corrupt, deceitful, and violent, their entire world will eventually come apart. What's happening is God undoing their world that he has spoken forth, and thus everything unravels into a flood. And that is the Genesis narrative of Noah's Ark and the Great Flood, which we will now delve into in What Do You Mean God Speaks?, where we explore important ideas, insights, and stories in Christianity for the skeptics who want to understand religion, to the Christians who have questions about their own beliefs, and everyone in between. I am Paul Seung-Ho-Jung, and this is our 10th episode of the second season. And so, everything unravels into the flood, from Lamech to Noah. Noah and the Great Flood. Many of us have at least heard of the story. The world becomes utterly corrupt, filled with evil and violence. So God brings down the great flood that covers the entire world as judgment upon humanity. But there was one righteous man, Noah. So God warns him about the coming flood and has him build an ark, a huge vessel that will take in his family and a pair of every living creature on land, beasts, birds, and the crawling things. Then the flood comes and everything on land perishes. But Noah and his family, along with all the creatures that went into the ark, survived the flood, and afterward went on to repopulate the world once again. Until the mid-1800s, people assumed that the Great Flood historically happened, and we had very good reasons for it. People found fossils of fish and seashells on land, even on hills and mountains, and they thought that they were left there when the flood water covered the entire world. And more interestingly, many vastly different cultures from every corner of the world have stories about a devastating flood that covered the world, or at least much of their lands. In Mesopotamia, just east of where the ancient Hebrews lived, there is the Epics of Gilgamesh, which reports an old flood story similar to that in Genesis. The gods plan to bring the flood, but tells a man named Unapishtim to build a large boat to keep him and other living things alive. If you go further east to India, there is a story in which one of the supreme deities in Hinduism, either Vishnu or Brahma depending on the stories, comes to a man named Manu in the form of a horned fish. The fish tells Manu to build a large boat to prepare for the flood, and later the fish pulls the boat to safety. Go even further east to China, and you will find stories that tell of a time when the rivers burst into a massive flood, so that the sages and the kings of old built dams to hold the waters back. Go westward from where the ancient Hebrews lived to the ancient Greeks, and they told stories of Zeus flooding the world because of the arrogance of humanity. But one of the gods warns a couple named Deucalion and Pyrrha so that they build a wooden chest to survive. And you'll find similar flood stories among the peoples in Africa and across the oceans among the First Nations in North America like the Ojibwe, and the Central American civilizations like the Maya, South Americans like the Canary, and even among the Aboriginal peoples of Hawaii and Australia. However, modern scientific findings have been inconsistent with the account of the Great Flood. We learned that what was once the ocean floor can rise over a very long time to become dry land today, which is why we can find fossils of ancient sea creatures on land. And aside from that, everything we've learned since from geology, paleontology, biology, and archaeology yielded no evidence of a global flood. Nothing that we'd expect to find if a flood once covered the entire planet. And in many cases, such as how living species are distributed across the planet, there are evidences against it. Still, there are some Christians who continue to reject these findings and argue for a global flood. But I'll let the scientists respond to their case and move on. And that's because I think the obsession of whether there physically was a flood that covered the entire planet thousands of years ago diminishes what the Genesis narrative of the flood is trying to communicate. That's not to say, though, that there is no historical basis for the flood stories. See, even if there was no global flood, there have been devastating local floods. And for those who lived through such a catastrophe, something like that is what struck their entire world as far as they're concerned. And that is why a later narrative in Genesis describes a severe but region-wide famine that struck the lands of Egypt and Levant as a famine that struck, quote-unquote, all the earth or the entire world. And also, it may be that the flood is a very general way to describe any large-scale climate catastrophes. And in both cases, our problem then becomes the opposite of what we have with the global flood. There are too many possible candidates for what the Great Flood in Genesis may be describing. For example, there is the Black Sea deluge around 8,000 years ago. The waters of the Mediterranean Sea may have broken into the Black Sea basin, flooding the land around it, which is just north of the mountains of Ararat, where Noah's Ark is traditionally believed to rest. Then there's the Thera volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean Sea 4,000 years ago, and the meteor that struck the Indian Ocean 5,000 years ago. Each case, it hurled titanic tsunamis that flooded vast tracts of coastal lands. For something older and more large scale, the end of the last ice age 8,400 years ago caused flooding worldwide, raising sea levels and forming entire lakes. And 70,000 years ago or so, there was a volcanic eruption that would have caused a massive climate catastrophe, a prolonged winter in this case instead of a flood. And genetic analysis has suggested, though it's not conclusive at all, that humanity as a species may have been threatened with extinction back then, with numbers falling to mere thousands of individuals. All of these are just conjectures, though. The Genesis account of the flood may have been drawn from any one of these events or more, or perhaps from an event that we don't even know yet. However, the account of the Great Flood that Genesis presents is something far, far greater in scope than any of these possibly historical events. Maybe we can think about it this way. In the 7th episode of this season, we considered how each narrative in the primeval history of Genesis is something like a summation of every event of its kind. So, the fall of Adam and Eve is not just about how two first individuals fell, but about how every human beings fall away from God. And Cain's murder of Abel is not just about that one murder, but about what is at the root of every murder. So the Great Flood, likewise, is not just about any one local flood or climate catastrophe in history, but about every such catastrophe that can happen anywhere in the entire world, which can fall upon anyone and any living thing in that world. And in that sense, it really is altogether the flood that covers the whole world and brings end to all living things on land, though not in the seas, which is interesting, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But even this understanding misses one crucial aspect of the flood in Genesis. This flood comes in response to what we make of our world. Humanity fills the world with evil, and God responds by bringing the flood. Let's go back to when Cain leaves the presence of God after murdering his brother. Now, he couldn't really leave the presence of God since, well, God is everywhere and all of reality is God speaking. But Cain had killed the voice of God that spoke to him from within, and then killed Abel because God was continuing to speak to him through Abel's life and actions. So by killing both sources, Cain is now severed from God from his end. Cain then wanders away from God and eventually has children, and then builds a city where they could live. So wait, who could have gotten together with Cain for there to be children in the first place? And we don't have any definite answer to that. One long-standing answer is that Adam and Eve just had other children that Genesis does not mention. Another answer is that since Adam and Eve represents humanity as a whole, there were actually more human beings than just that one couple. Now, whichever the answer is, the key point is that Cain had descendants and that they are likewise severed from God from their end. Now, we need to consider what that means. Abel represented a life that relates to God properly, a trusting openness to reality, lovingly giving the best of himself to how he engages everything and everyone in his life. Cain represented a life that relates to God in a distorted way, close to reality, engaging everything and everyone in his life with increasing distrust, arrogance, and even resentment, though he may have hidden this with a veneer of civility, which is how he probably managed to murder his brother. But there was a voice that spoke to him against living like this, which was the voice of God. This is a voice that speaks most truthfully about who you truly are and what is happening around you and what you should become, even if and especially if these truths are not what you want to hear. This voice may speak from within you as a better version of yourself that continually beckons to you, or this voice may speak through what is happening in your life from how reality around you is unfolding in response to your actions. This voice could also be the lives and actions of people like Abel in your life. But Cain has rejected this voice violently and irreversibly in every way to the point of killing his brother. This, by the way, is what differentiates what I mean by distrust from simply having doubts or questions. We may have questions or fears, but we can also be open to hear more. Distrust and resentment of Cain, however, is one that closes oneself off at a fundamental level. Then the question is, what if everyone lived like that? Because Genesis seems to imply that Cain's descendants all follow their father's example. Everyone engages reality with distrust and resentment. Everyone views each other with suspicion, arrogance, and hostility, which they hide underneath a facade. And they cannot correct themselves because they silence any voice that speaks any truth they don't want to acknowledge, with violence if needed. But how would a society of such people even function? What would hold it together? It wouldn't be mutual trust because they distrust each other. Nor would it be some set of profound truths or moral ideals that they are all working toward because they reject the voice that beckons them toward such horizons. So what will hold such a society together will be power. Power to coerce, to control, or to compel. You have no need of trust if you have power to simply coerce others to your ends. You have no need of truth if deceit and lies are what grant you power to control. You have no need of justice if you have power to compel others to your will. Cain's descendant, Lamech, who is depicted as the father of civilization, boasts of such power when he sings of how he kills anyone who dares to even strike out at him. And a society in which such power is increasingly the only thing that keeps it together will soon tear itself apart, for reality will unfold in a certain way for such a society. God will speak in a certain way. One way we can think about this is that everyone's living out a scenario depicted in what's often called the prisoner's dilemma. Here's one nation-scale version of that dilemma. So, say 2 nations capable of making nuclear weapons are facing off against each other. Now, each nation has 2 choices: to make such weapons or abandon them. The best scenario is for both nations to choose to abandon nuclear arms. The worst scenario is for both nations to arm themselves with such weapons, leading to a possible world-ending nuclear war. But the problem is, if your nation abandons the nukes, but the other nation secretly makes them, then it will have complete power over you to destroy you whenever it wishes with no reprisal. Whereas if you make the nukes while your enemies abandon them, you will have power over them. Now, if the two sides trusted each other, then the best scenario is possible. But if the two sides are motivated by distrust, hostility, and need for power, which was the case for Cain's society, then both nations will build up nuclear weapons and aim them at each other, pushing the entire world to the brink of destruction. We can substitute nuclear weapons to, say, breaking environmental or ethical standard for personal profit, or, say, spreading misinformation and lies about your political opponents, or even just people we disagree with. In Cain's society, best scenario will be rejected by everyone, leading to the worst possible scenario being realized every time. And so, Genesis reports that the wickedness of humanity becomes great upon the world, so that their every inclination, their every choice, is evil. The world thus becomes corrupt and filled with violence, and in response to what the world has become, God declares that all of humanity and every living creature on land will be destroyed. God will bring forth the flood. Why a flood, though? Why not meteors and fire? That's what happened with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, as we'll see in a later narrative in Genesis. Or why not a plague, like what happened in Egypt in the book of Exodus? Why water? Well, we need to remember that water in Genesis, at least in the primeval history, is more than just water. It is the physical substance of chaos, of unbounded possibility without form. Let's review the opening of Genesis. God sets forth an endless expanse of possibilities, the fathomless reaches of water, and then speaks forth the light, the sky, and the land. And each time, the unbounded watery possibility becomes something. With light, it becomes a world that can be perceived with a reference point and time. With the sky, it becomes a world with space that separates different realms and things and possibilities from each other. Then with land, it becomes a world where there can be things with defined existence, with shapes and forms. Then from the ground of that land, God speaks forth a myriad of different living things, each with different forms, and gives them the breath of life. Eventually, God brings forth humanity that will live among them and rule them. The primordial waters of possibilities remain, however. God places the endless expanse of water above the sky and below the earth in the great deep. Now, Genesis reports that when God brings the flood, the springs of the deep below the earth and the waters beyond the sky bursts into the world. That is to say, the great flood is God reverting the world back to the expanse of water in the beginning. God is withdrawing what he has spoken during creation, along with the breath of life that he has given. But what would that mean? We can begin thinking of this in terms of how we experience our world. So, to say that God speaks forth reality is to say that reality is like a speech. And to say that reality is like a speech is to say that our speech can describe the world and all the things in it. This is what it means for our scientific discourse to describe and understand nature, or for our conversations about justice to actually move us to justice, or for our poetry to be beautiful. God speaks forth the world. That's reality. We speak of that world. That's truth, or at least us reaching for truth. And our world, the world that we inhabit and perceive, the world that we experience and know, is found where our speech meets God's speech. But is that still the case in a society fathered by Cain and ruled by Lamech? Would our speech meet God's speech in a world where everyone silences any voice that speaks truths that they don't want to acknowledge and ignores any voice that calls them to change and move toward a more loving, just, and truthful versions of themselves. What will be the world that we experience if distrust, suspicion, and hostility is the fundamental way that everyone approaches that world and everyone else in it? What would happen to our speech in a society that lives primarily by violence and power? And if the world that we perceive is found upon where our speech meets God's speech, what would that world become? The thing is, how we perceive or know anything depends on the words of others and our relationship with them. So take, for example, the vaccine you're taking for the pandemic. What really is it to you? And the answer to that would depend on how you regard those that made or promote the vaccine. Now, our societies are such that we can trust our health officials, more or less, and pharmaceuticals that produce these vaccines. They have some level of accountability. So seriously, listen to your health officials. But let's say, hypothetically, that you did live in a society where these vaccines are produced by an extremely corrupt pharmaceutical company, which cares only about raising its profit margins and has no regard whatsoever for people's health or welfare. Then what's before you is no longer a vaccine. It's something dangerous or a ploy to raise profit. But what if they aren't the only ones that are lying? What if your political leader, who's been telling you that the pandemic is a hoax concocted to remove him from office and sell fake vaccines, is exposed for covering up the death toll in the hospitals? What if the newspaper that ran the expose reports that those who did not take the vaccine are becoming seriously ill? But what if you know that the reporters of that newspaper routinely make up numbers and lie either to suit their political views or to cater to their readers? Or even worse, what if you've been doing the same thing as a radio show host, but you're no longer aware that you're doing it because you've been lying to yourself for so long? Now, with all of that, what is a vaccine? Well, it's possibly a vaccine. It's possibly a scam. It's possibly dangerous. Or it is possibly life-saving. Or is possibly just a placebo. With all the lies, it is now an unknown, formless, fluctuating thing. But in a society where God brings a flood, vaccine wouldn't be the only thing that we'd be lying about. It would be everything. Every news we hear, every fact that we learn, every action that we take. And everyone will be lying. Everyone is vying for power. Everyone is undermining everyone else. Everyone, leaders, teachers, priests, scientists, artists, mechanics, merchants, farmers, builders, laborers, everyone. So we can never tell whether someone is speaking the truth or is maneuvering for power. In such a world, everything around us would be in a flux. See, when everything that enables us to know the world is lying, then the world that we experience loses all shape and form. We no longer know what the world is. We no longer know what's really in it, what's really happening, who is really before us, and whether we are safe with them. The world we experience turns into a dark, watery expanse of unknown possibilities. Not the possibility that is waiting to become something which God speaks forth to us, but the possibility that is kept in a constant flux because we are always lying about it and can never trust each other. Reality is God speaking, and so reality is like a speech. But our speech is no longer like reality. Our speech instead is now floodwater with which we are drowning each other. And so, everything begins to unravel into a flood. This is how reality unfolds when everyone becomes Cain. That is how God brings the flood. There is more than that, however. That society may have been tenuously holding on, held together mostly by fear, dominance, and power, with the barest level of truth, trust, and goodwill. Then a crisis strikes, because crisis always strikes. It could have been a drought or a sickness. it could literally be a flood. Maybe the one that happened at the end of the Ice Age, raising sea levels and forming lakes where people used to live. But the world of humanity is now so fragile that it cannot respond. Corruption and apathy meant no adequate preparation were in place, no reservoir of water or food for the drought, no protocols for illness, no dams or dikes for flooding, no early evacuation, nothing. The problem grows as the leaders are too busy blaming their opponents or their subordinates, and the people are too busy blaming their leaders. Those who should have been trained to come up with solutions are instead preoccupied with how to turn this into means to gain more power or to bring down their rivals. Distrust and hostility makes meaningful cooperation impossible. More time is spent on discrediting your opponent than trying to work together. Meanwhile, drought becomes a famine. Sickness becomes a pandemic. Flood rises until it wipes out entire cities. The tenuous ties that barely held people and the society together so far finally breaks apart, and people no longer even bother hiding their hostility toward each other. Eventually, even the barest rules and norms that people had at least pretended to follow are abandoned, as the power and dominance that kept them in check is no longer able to do so. Society collapses, everything breaks apart. The famine, the pandemic, the flood ravages the entire land far beyond what it could have or should have. Even then, no one can truly tell what it is that's really happening or what it is they ought to be doing, other than that it is a catastrophe that has engulfed everything. Everything is in a flux, as if in the dark, murky waters, and only thing that is definite is that everything is being destroyed and there is no place that they can know is safe. Nothing in the entire world they know will remain standing. God has brought the flood, and it has covered the whole world. But Genesis introduces a second strand of this narrative. There is another line apart from Cain's. Adam and Eve had another son. Eve named him Seth, saying, "God has given me another child because Abel died." Seth, who takes Abel's place, has children, and Genesis reports that one of his descendants, Enoch, walked with God his entire life so that before he died, God took him away from the world. And Enoch had children, and one of his descendants was Noah. Biblical scholars have noticed that the lineages of Cain and Seth have individuals that have very similar names, though they appear in different order. So, for example, Cain's son was also named Enoch. Seth's line had Mahalalel, and Cain's line had Mehujael. Cain's line had Irad, and Seth's line had Jared. Seth's line had Methuselah, and Cain's line had Methushael. Cain's descendant was Lamech, and Noah's father was also named Lamech. Of course, different people can have similar names or even same names. I'm Paul, but so are many, many other people. There may be more meaning to this, though. This is my take on it, but Genesis may be pointing at how human society, human civilization, has another side. Even when it becomes corrupt and filled with violence and evil, that same society and people may have side to them that may yet walk with God, a side to them that can lead to Noah. Far too often, they are not the ones that form our world and lead it, otherwise God would not bring the flood. Yet either way, down the lineage of Seth, who has taken Abel's place, came Noah, and Noah walked with God, and God regarded Noah as righteous. So God speaks to Noah, "I am going to put an end to all people, for the world is filled with violence because of them. I will destroy them along with the world. So make yourself an ark of wood, make rooms in it, and waterproof it with pitch." And this will be a monumental project. The ark was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high with 3 decks. That means each of the 3 decks would be about as large as 10 NBA basketball courts placed side by side, so 30 courts in all. It was to be that large because Noah was responsible not only for his family. God tells Noah to take in a pair of every creature living on land, livestock, wild animals, crawling things, and birds, and bring them into the ark to save them from the coming flood. Now, the imagery of Noah's ark may inspire some people to build their own arks, so to speak, underground bunkers, island refugees, nuclear shelters, and so on. But that would be missing the point. See, what saves Noah is not just the ark per se, because if that's all it took, then others could have very well made their own arks to save themselves from the flood. They would have had time to make them, since it took Noah a very long time to make his, with just his immediate family helping him. So, what saves Noah? What saves us when everything unravels into the flood? We will explore that next time on What Will Survive the Flood. Thank you for listening, and please continue to support this series by following, subscribing, and sharing this series with others. Also, please take a moment to rate or review this series on Apple Podcasts or other platforms. And you can also support this series by buying me coffee at www.buymeacoffee.com/PaulSOC. The link is provided in the episode description. Yeah, so this episode is going up on the night of Christmas. So Merry Christmas, everyone.